It's Don here from the board. Thanks for coming along and checking out this video. So this is the next part in my wood turning adventures. In the previous part, you would have seen me talk through some of the upgrades and pieces that I bought for the mini lathe so that I could actually try and turn something. And you would have also seen me talk about this piece of citrus branch pomelo tree from my parents' place, which incidentally turned out to be a bit of hardwood, which made it really difficult to actually turn. You know, it's being hardwood, it's very hard. So as a novice wood turner trying to do that on a mini lathe, that was not a good idea. So I got some lighter wood. So this is what we think is actually fig, right? And this is a different piece, but I've had opportunity to chuck a piece about that size roughly onto the mini lathe with all those parts that I talked about in the previous video. So I want to go through some photos of when I was actually doing that, and then we'll have a look at the end results and all the challenges that have come from it. So here is that new setup. I've got it clamped to my bench. There's the 3D printed bracket for the tailstock that allows me to actually extend it out. And I've pinned it in and I've started taking it down and removing the bark. Definitely a lot easier to work with than the pomelo branch, right? And you know, I had a bit more experience in knowing what I was doing. What I did discover though, which would come back later on to be a pain, was the fact that it actually had cavities in it from like timber boring pests and things like that. But you know what? This is non-commercial timber. This is very natural, pesticide free, very organic grown fruit tree, a fig tree at my parents'. So it's nice to see this kind of stuff actually in some sense. So I'd cut it down to roughly the size that I wanted, and I started reducing it down so that I could have like a tenon for the 3-jaw chuck to actually clamp onto. And yeah, just using the different chisels. And this is what I ended up with. So there's a piece that, you know, the end was cut to be flat, and then I had this little bit cut in so that the actual tenon could hold on to it, so it would sit in a 3-jaw chuck like this. And then I started trying to turn it, so that was the end on that I'd already cleaned up to be nice and flat. That's the setup there with the extendable tailstock with the drill bit in it. Now this was a 4.8mm drill bit, and you can see what I meant by the fact that the standard block that the rail that all of this sits on is just woefully short for being able to do this kind of work, to the point where, like, I don't, did I have a picture of it? Oh, I must not have uploaded it, but those screws there, those bolts there, and the little bits that slide in this rail are only half in. Now, it has enough grip to be able to do what it needs to do with half in, but if I was to use a longer drill bit, then you're going to have some challenges. You're just not going to have the length to be able to do it. And if you were working with longer pieces of wood, you definitely would not have the length to do it. So me upgrading to that 600mm bed is definitely a worthwhile investment. So that was just me tapping in a little bit with the 4 just to see. And the thing that really throws me off is the fact that the actual core, the heartwood of this branch, is off center, whereas I'm drilling over here, so it looks really weird, but that is relatively centered. That's the depth, so you can see the actual length of the pin that's in there. These 2 pins are the same length, and that's how far I'd actually tapped in it. There were some challenges in regards to doing that, because when you do, say, metal lathing, you can lubricate by adding oil or coolant, but when you do wood turning, I don't know if you can add anything like that to help it, but it was making an absolute racket because, you know, it's dry drilling and it was squeaking and just like very ear wrenching to do that. And the end result is this. Now, the end of it's really messy, and you can see the actual jaw marks here because when I was trying to shape this down from it being perfectly straight to having a curve on it, the tool was catching on these channels. The tool was catching on the boring marks from the pests that had been in the timber. And it was actually so bad that it was ripping it out of the three-jaw chuck. It actually nearly smacked me in the face. And if you heard my podcast when I talked about this ages ago, um, there was risk that this was even just going to fly off my balcony, and then I would have been extremely upset, spending all the effort for it to just disappear into the void off my balcony. So I had to tighten the three-jaw chuck quite a bit to, even though if it was catching, it wasn't just going to rip it out and go flying, but that ended up in having these marks. Alternatively, I could have used sandpaper potentially to shape it and smooth it, but I don't have any on hand. And similarly, so the tools that I am using that you can see in these backgrounds they're very dull now, I would say. They're quite blunt from after working with the hardwood and doing the work on this, but I don't have any means to sharpen them at this point in time. So they were doing more tearing than cutting cleanly compared to when I started doing this work. So unfortunately, that is where it ended up, and I didn't do any additional cleanup of it, but it does give hope that I could, and I might end up with a better end result. But as far as beginner wood turning goes, I'm really happy with getting to this point and actually shaping it and cutting it down and smoothing it and roughing and all that kind of stuff and learning about the chuck and how it holds. If I have the money to, in the future, I'll probably also get a four-jaw chuck so that I can actually hold the piece a little bit better and maybe apply less pressure. I don't know. It's just stuff to think about, as well as upgrading all the parts and putting it on the 600mm bed. Now, I do have that piece, so we can have a look at a little bit closer. And here it is. So if the focus will work, you can see there's the actual chuck, the three-jaw grip marks on it, and you can see how deep that actual cavity is. So as it was going around, it was catching and causing problems, and you can see there's some other channels and tracks here as well from natural pests in the timber. You'll be able to see the tool marks on this are still quite distinct. There's sort of the grooves and it's quite rough. So had I put sandpaper on it as it was going around, it definitely could have smoothed it out and given it a much nicer finish. The hole on the end of it is actually quite clean for what it is. There was a bit of slack and the three-jaw chuck was wobbling a little bit, but it was a cheap thing designed for a tiny little mini hobby lathe. Like, I can't really say too much about that, right? The problem was this, I went from a 4.8 and then I changed it to a 5mm because I'd roughly measured this encoder to be 5mm, and well, it just wedges, but it won't go in, and I don't really want to force it, but it'll but it won't sit in. You can see like it's just getting in there, and you can see the actual marks on the rim of that. If I had a drill press, for example, then I could just mount that in some jaws. Oi, focus. And then I could use the drill press to press in those holes instead, and then I could make it the right width. And additionally, what I could do on the side is I could tap another hole through it, I could tap in an insert, and then you could put in a set screw to hold it against the actual post. But as far as this goes, I'm going to call this a success because I've certainly learnt a lot on the process of turning. I know that I definitely need to do something with the tools to sharpen them, but I'm getting more comfortable with the setup and making the decisions and the process, the workflow for actually cutting and shaping and moving stuff around and drilling and all that kind of stuff. So, I still have another two pieces of this. So to turn that into that is actually quite a rewarding experience. Now you can see on this one, there's already scores and splits and, goodness knows what other defects are going to be in this piece of wood, but you won't know until you start getting into it. So there you go. There is my first ever, not quite there, home turned encoder knob. Now, if you're somebody that's very handy with tools, if you've got a lathe at home, even a full-size one, you could start making this kind of stuff. And if you enjoy woodworking and hand tools, if you enjoy miniature tools and whatnot, and keyboards is a hobby, here's another avenue to pair them up, right? Well, that's it. I'm just going to put that aside, and when I get time and opportunity to, I'll start working on the next one, although I probably need to think about sharpening somehow before I spend too much time destroying another bit of wood without much end purpose on that. Rightio, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that walkthrough and just checking out what I ended up with in this tiny little hand-turned knob. Well, if you like this kind of stuff, you want to see me do more different, unusual keyboard-related things, then of course, please hit that like button. And of course, you can hit the subscribe and bell notifications too. So, look after yourselves, be good to each other, and of course, as usual, until next time, happy clacking.